For our third video, we're going to be reviewing quadratics and quadratic equations. So let's fill out these notes. What makes a quadratic equation? The first thing we talk about when we talk about quadratic equations is that they have to have an exponent. So a quadratic equation is an equation with a highest degree of 2. Okay, meaning I can't have an exponent more than 2. So let's go through some examples and talk about whether or not they are quadratic equations. This first one, 5x plus 2. This is not a quadratic equation because we do not have that exponent of 2. You need an exponent of 2 in order for it to be a quadratic equation. Let's take a look at another example. 3 minus 5x squared. This is a quadratic equation because if you take a look, we have an exponent of 2. So this one is a quadratic equation, even though it's not in standard form, and we'll talk about what that means in a little bit. So 5x cubed plus 4x squared plus 8. Right away, you might want to say yes, that it's a quadratic equation because we have an exponent of 2. But the problem here is that we also have an exponent of 3. If we take a look at our definition, the highest exponent we can have, the highest degree we can have is 2. So this one is not a quadratic because we cannot have an exponent of 3. Standard form of a quadratic equation is y equals to ax squared plus bx plus c. And let's work on getting some examples into standard form. So copy this first one. Negative 5x squared plus 2 plus 8x. You'll notice that in standard form, you need the ax squared first. So we're going to put that one first along with the coefficient, negative 5x squared, followed by bx. So followed by the term with an x variable. So that's plus 8x, and then followed by your constant plus 2. Okay, let's do another example. 3 minus 5x squared. So again, you want the x squared term first. Let's put that first and make sure you take the coefficient with it. The coefficient in this case was a negative 5. We don't have a bx term, so we're just going to skip that and then bring down your plus 3. Last example, let's try this one. 8x minus 2x squared plus 6. So the term that needs to come first is the one with the x squared and bring the coefficient with it. So that's negative 2x squared. Followed by the one with just an x. So that's going to be plus 8x. And then plus your constant is plus 6. Solutions to quadratic equations. We have several names for these, and we went over some of them in class. We have roots, zeros, and that's basically the names for it. And where we can find them is they're located on the x-axis. Okay, so let's continue with this review. The next thing we're going to go over is how to factor. So let's follow these steps. Step 1 says put equation into standard form. I noticed my equation's already in standard form. Let's check that off. Step 2, create a table of factors for a times c. So that means that I need to first identify my a, b, and c. Your a in this case is 1. Your b is going to be 10. And your c is going to be 16. Okay, so I'm going to do that on the side. I have a times c. A times c is 1 times 16. I get 16. Our b value in this case is, well, let's hold off on that. Let's just write our factors of 16. I have 1 and 16. And also, negative 1 and negative 16 also work. Okay, I also have 2 and 8. And I have negative 2 and negative 8. 3 doesn't go into 16, but I have 4 and 4. I also have negative 4 and negative 4. Okay, so now that I have my list of factors for a times c, I want to see which one of these adds up to b. Our b value, we said earlier, was 10. 1 plus 16 is 17, doesn't work. Negative 1 plus negative 16 is negative 17, doesn't work. 2 plus 8 is 10, so that works. That's the one we're going to be using. Take your original equation, n squared plus 10n plus 16 equals to 0. And what we're going to do with those two numbers that we just found is replace your middle term. So copy everything else down, n squared plus 16 at the end. And instead of writing 10n in the middle, we're going to replace it with the two factors that I found, 2n and 8n. Oops, and I forgot equals to 0. Okay, from this point, what you're going to do is separate them into two groups. From the first group, you can factor out an n, and you'll be left with n plus 2. From your second group, you can factor out a positive 8, and you're going to be left with n plus 2. So an easy check for ourselves right now is that the two things inside the parentheses are the same. Okay, so they both should look exactly the same. They both say n plus 2. I know I'm on the right track. Now I see that twice. I'm going to write it once. That's one of my factors, n plus 2. My other factor is everything else that I pulled out. So n plus 8 equals to 0. So we're done with factoring. Our next step, let's separate this into two equations and set each equation equal to 0. So n plus 2 is equal to 0, and n plus 8 is equal to 0. To solve for n on your left side, subtract 2 from both sides. And I get n equals to negative 2 is one of my solutions. And then on the other side, we're going to minus 8 to get n by itself, and we get n equals negative 8 as our other solution. Okay, so let's do another problem with factoring. If you would like to try this problem on your own, go ahead and pause the video. If not, we're going to walk through it together right now. So step 1 says put equation into standard form. I noticed that my equation is to put it into standard form. And if I want to do that, I need to move this negative 3 over to the other side. Because if we recall, standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c has to equal to 0. I need to get it to equal to 0 before I can factor. So to move the negative 3 over to the other side, let's add 3 to both sides. And now you'll have x squared minus 4x plus 3 is equal to 0. Now we have an equation in standard form, so now I can factor. Create a table of factors for a times c. So your a value is 1. Your b value is negative 4, and your c value is 3. Let's make that table over here. A times c, well, that's 1 times 3 gives you a positive 3. Let's list our factors for positive 3. I have 1 and 3, and also negative 1 and negative 3. Now I need to know which set of these factors adds up to my b value, which is negative 4. 1 plus 3 gives you positive 4, so that doesn't work. Negative 1 plus negative 3, that works. So we're going to take these two numbers, negative 1 and negative 3, and we're going to be replacing our middle term with these two numbers. Everything else stays the same. So x squared, the plus 3, and equals to 0. All we're doing is replacing that middle term. Instead of negative 4x, I have minus 1x and minus 3x. The next thing we want to do is draw parentheses around the first two terms and then around the last two terms. And now we're going to factor by grouping. In this first group, I can factor out an x, and I'll be left with x minus 1. In this second group, be very careful. We're factoring out a negative 3, so that we are left with x minus 1 inside of our parentheses. Just like before, an easy check, I see that my x minus 1s are the same inside the parentheses, so that's going to be one of my factors. Your other factor is everything that's left over. Okay, so let me make this smaller so we can do some work on it. Alright, that was really crazy. Okay, so once we have the factors, what you want to do is divide them up into two equations. I have x minus 1 is equal to 0, and x minus 3 is equal to 0. You set each factor equal to 0. To solve on my left side, let's add 1 to both sides, and I get x is equal to 1. To solve on your right side, let's add 3 to both sides, and you get x is equal to 3. Make sure you're very comfortable with factoring. That does appear on the regions a lot. We're going to work on the quadratic formula next. Okay, so let's continue. We're going to work on quadratic formula. Please make sure you have your graphing calculator with you. We're just going to try to simplify these radicals before we start using the quadratic formula. The square root key is right here above the x squared. We have to press the second button to access it. So the first question says the square root of 49. And I get that that's going to be 7. Okay, next says negative 3 times the square root of 36. So if I keep the negative 3 and I want to see if I can break down the square root of 36. The square root of 36 gives you 6, so this is really just negative 3 times 6, which gives us negative 18. The square root of 56. So you'll notice when you try to take the square root of 56 in your calculator, you get a decimal. We don't want that, so what you want to do is break it up into two numbers, one of which is a perfect square. So I know 56 can be divided by 4. And I get 14. So 56, I'm breaking it down into 4 and 14. I can't take the square root of 4. The square root of 4 is going to be 2. So this is really just 2 times the square root of 14. You cannot break down the square root of 14 anymore, so that just stays like that. Okay, next, negative 5 times the square root of 288. So let's first try to put the square root of 288 into our calculator. Doesn't work, so let's break it up. Perfect square that goes into 288, I know it's 144, and 144 times 2 gives you 288. So now I can take the square root of 144, and I get that that's going to be 12. So this is negative 5 times 12, square root of 2. Negative 5 times 12 gives you negative 60, so that's negative 60, square root of 2. Okay, so now let's try to apply the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula is given to you at all times. And just very quickly, let's just review. Standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. So let's check. My equation is in standard form. It's equal to 0. The exponents are in order from greatest to least. And now we want to plug into this formula. So when you are plugging in, first of all, let's plug in using parentheses. You're going to rewrite the quadratic formula without the letters. Instead of the letters, you're going to write parentheses. So negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. So notice I didn't write any of the letters. I replaced them with parentheses. Our a value is 2. Our b value is 3. And our c value is negative 5. We're just going to plug these in. In the first parentheses was b. And our second parentheses was b, which is 3. And that parentheses next to the 4 is a, which is 2. And this last one over here is c, which is negative 5. On the bottom, I have 2a. So instead of writing a, I'm plugging it 2. Okay, next step says simplify everything outside of the square root. So let's do that. Everything outside of the square root. I have negative parentheses 3. That just gives you negative 3. I have the plus or minus. I'm going to draw my square root symbol, but I'm going to save that for last. In my denominator, underneath my fraction is 2 times 2. That gives you 4. And now so we're done with that. Let's simplify everything inside the square root. Take your calculator. Don't press the square root button yet. Just everything inside the square root. So I have 3 squared minus 4, parentheses 2, parentheses negative 5. So inside my square root, I get 49. Step 4, find the square root of the number. So let's do that. X is equal to negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 49 is going to be 7. and divided by 4. Next step is to separate into two equations because we have a plus or minus symbol. We don't know how to do that all at once, so we're going to write two equations. X equals to negative 3 plus 7 divided by 4, and x equals to negative 3 minus 7 divided by 4. Just going to do this entire thing in your calculator. So if you remember to get a fraction in your calculator, press alpha, y equals, and it's the first one. So I have negative 3 plus 7 divided by 4. And we got 1. So one of my solutions is x equals to 1. Let's try the other one. Same thing, alpha, y equals, and then I have negative 3 minus 7, and 4 in my denominator. That gives you negative 5 over 2. Okay, so that's how we use the quadratic formula. If you would like to try the next video on your own before we go over it, please pause the video here. Otherwise, we're going to continue. Okay, so let's do this next problem together. It says solve for x to the nearest 10, and we're giving the equation x squared plus x minus 5 is equal to 0. So first thing I'm checking for is that it's in standard form. It absolutely is, so let's identify our a, b, and c. A is 1, b is 1, c is negative 5. The next thing we're going to do is copy over the quadratic formula. X equals to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And now the second time you write this formula, we're going to replace all the letters with parentheses. So negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. Okay, so make that smaller. So now that you have all the open parentheses, all you're really doing is plugging in the numbers that you found before. So the first one, b is 1, b is 1, a is 1, c is negative 5, and a is 1. Okay, next step is to simplify everything outside of your parentheses. So I'll have x equals to negative 1 plus or minus, and we're going to leave the square root open, and we're going to simplify the bottom, and I get that that's 2. So now let's plug everything inside your radical into our calculator to figure out what that is. 1 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 5. That gives us 21. So inside my square root is going to be 21. So the next thing we want to do is to find the square root of 21. Let's use our calculator. The square root of 21. It gives us a decimal, and we really don't like that. So you want to just leave it as the square root of 21. Let's skip that step for now. Our next step is to break it up into two equations. So one of the equations is x equals to negative 1 plus the square root of 21 divided by 2. Our other equation, x equals to negative 1 minus the square root of 21 divided by 2. And you'll see that we can enter this into our calculator exactly as we have written. So let's do this top equation. Again, to get the fractions, press alpha y equals. And on top, I have negative 1 plus the square root of 21 divided by 2. And I get 1.79. So the problem tells us to solve it to the nearest 10th. The 10th place is where the 7 is. We look at the number next to it. It's a 9. That tells me that I should round it up. So I get x equals to 1.8 as one of my solutions. Let's do that again. Alpha y equals. And this time it's negative 1 minus the square root of 21 all over 2. And I get x equals to negative 2.79. Again, the 10th place is a 7. The number after that is a 9. That tells me that I should round up. So x equals to negative 2.8. So this last problem down here requires us to do factoring and quadratic formula. If you would like, please pause the video here and try these by yourself before we go over it. Okay, let's do factoring first. So the first thing I need to do is get this equation into standard form. It's not equal to 0, so I know it's not in standard form. 3x squared plus 10x equals to 8. If I want to get that into standard form, you need to subtract 8 from both sides so that I can get it equal to 0. So now I have 3x squared plus 10x minus 8 is equal to 0. So now in standard form, so the next thing I can do is identify my a, b, and c values. A is equal to 3, b is equal to 10, and c is equal to negative 8. Next step is to make that list of factors for a times c. So a times c is 3 times negative 8, that's negative 24, and let's start making factors of negative 24. I have 1 and negative 24. I also have negative 1 and positive 24. 2 and negative 12, or negative 2 and 12. 3 also goes into negative 24, negative 8 times, which means I can also have negative 3 and positive 8. And then we also have 4 and negative 6, or negative 4 and 6. So now let's see which one of these adds up to our b value, which is 10. Does not add up, does not add up. 2 and negative 12 give me negative 10, so that's really close, but it's not the right answer. Negative 2 and 12, that works. That gives you a positive 10, so these are the two numbers you want to use. So again, what we're doing is we're replacing that middle term. So I have 3x squared plus 10x minus 8 equals to 0. We're replacing the middle term, which is 10x, with the two numbers that I just found. So 3x squared minus 2x plus 12x minus 8 equals to 0. Now let's draw our parentheses around the first two terms and around the last two terms. The only thing I can factor out from the first two terms is x, and you're going to be left with 3x minus 2. And then you can factor out a positive 4 from your last two terms, and you're going to be left with 3x minus 2 equals 0. So again, a good check for myself is that inside the parentheses, I have the same thing. Okay, I have the same factor. That becomes one of your factors, 3x minus 2. And your other factor is everything that's left over, which is x plus 4. This is equal to 0. Okay, next, separate them into two equations and set each equation equal to 0. So I have 3x minus 2 equals to 0. And x plus 4 equals to 0. To solve the left side, let's add 2 to both sides. I get 3x equals to 2. And then we want to divide by 3 to get x by itself. So x is equal to 2 over 3. That's one of my solutions. The other solution, I just have to subtract 4 from both sides. And I get x is equal to negative 4. So those are my two solutions. We're going to check it again with the quadratic formula to make sure it works. Okay, same problem, but using the quadratic formula. So let's copy down the quadratic formula for ourselves first. It is x equals to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So this was the square root. We already have our a, b, and c from what we were doing before, so let's just use that. So when we copy over the quadratic formula, we're going to leave parentheses where we have variables. So x equals to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times C all over 2A. That first parenthesis is represented with B. Our B value was 10. Again, it's B, so this is 10. Then it's A, which is 3. And then it's C, which is negative 8. And on the bottom is A, which is 3. So the first thing we want to do is simplify everything on the outside. So negative parentheses 10 is just negative 10. Plus or minus, let's leave the square root open. Let's do the bottom first. 2 times 3 is 6. And now we're going to plug everything inside your square root into your calculator. 10 squared minus 4, parentheses 3, parentheses negative 8. And I get 196. So the next thing you want to do is see if you can break down the square root of 196. The square root of 196 is 14. So x equals to negative 10 plus or minus 14 all over 6. Now we create two equations, one with plus, one with minus. So x equals to negative 10 plus 14 over 6. And the other one is x equals to negative 10 minus 14 over 6. So we're just going to do the entire thing in our calculator. To get the fraction bar, press alpha y equals. I have negative 10 plus 14 divided by 6. And I get x equals to 2/3. Hey, that matches our answer from before. Okay, let's do the other one. Alpha y equals, to get the fraction bar, negative 10 minus 14, divided by 6. So 6 on the bottom. And I get negative 4. So you'll notice factoring quadratic formula, we get the same answer because these are our solutions, these are our roots. You can choose whichever method you like. If you turn the page, you will see that there are 4 problems for you to complete on your own. Please complete those.